What was the United States actually doing during World War II? In Russia, there's a popular belief that America waited until the very end, that it stayed out of the fight until Germany's defeat was inevitable, then stepped in to claim credit and profit from the aftermath. It's a powerful narrative, but it's not the full story. Let's take a closer look. First, one thing should be clear. No serious historian denies the enormous role of the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest theater of the war. The Soviet Union suffered staggering losses, millions of soldiers and civilians, and bore the brunt of the ground fighting against Nazi Germany. The Red Army fought some of the largest land battles in human history, and the Soviet people paid an unimaginable price. But World War II was exactly that. A world war. 62 nations were involved. Fighting stretched across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The war was fought between two massive coalitions, the Axis powers and the Allied powers. Victory over Nazism was not achieved by one country alone. America before Pearl Harbor. For years, the United States tried to avoid direct involvement in Europe's conflicts. After the trauma of World War I, where over 100,000 Americans were killed, much of the American public wanted nothing to do with another overseas war. Isolationism was strong. Meanwhile, the world was on fire. In 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Soon after, Europe was engulfed in war. Germany occupied France and bombed Britain. The Soviet Union invaded Finland and annexed the Baltic states. In Asia, Japan had already invaded China in 1937, committing horrific atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre. Japan had also occupied Korea for decades and was expanding aggressively across East Asia. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that even if America wanted to stay neutral, the global balance of power was collapsing. Lend-Lease, America's arsenal of democracy. Before American troops entered combat, the US was already deeply involved, economically and industrially. In March 1941, Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. The idea was simple. If a neighbor's house is on fire, you lend them a hose, even if you're not sure you'll get it back. Roosevelt used that exact analogy. Through Lend-Lease, the United States supplied Allied nations with weapons, vehicles, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, and raw materials. Between 1941 and 1945, 42 countries received aid. The largest recipients were the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. The numbers were enormous. The US provided about $30 billion in aid to Britain. The Soviet Union received approximately $11 billion worth of supplies. From late 1941 through 1943, the most difficult years of the war for the USSR, American shipments included tanks, aircraft, trucks, aviation fuel, aluminum, copper, explosives, steel, and critical industrial machinery. The US delivered roughly 26,000 tons of nickel and nearly 17,000 tons of molybdenum concentrate, materials essential for tank armor production, including for the T-34. More than 22,000 aircraft were supplied to the Soviet Union by the US and Britain combined. Hundreds of thousands of trucks and jeeps improved Red Army mobility. American radio and communications equipment were widely used, especially before Soviet industry fully ramped up production. Food shipments also played a vital role for a country suffering occupation and devastation. Lend-Lease didn't win the war by itself, but it significantly strengthened Allied production, mobility, and logistics, all crucial factors in modern industrial warfare. December 7th, 1941, the war comes to America. Despite growing involvement, the United States did not formally enter the war until December 7th, 1941. That morning, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, striking the US Pacific Fleet. Over 2,400 Americans were killed. 4 battleships were sunk, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling it a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan almost unanimously. Shortly afterward, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fully at war in both Europe and the Pacific. The Pacific War. The Pacific theater was vast and brutal. Japan initially achieved rapid successes, seizing territory across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. But in June 1942, the tide began to turn at the Battle of Midway. U.S. naval forces sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a decisive victory that crippled Japan's offensive capabilities. From that point forward, the United States began an island-hopping campaign, capturing strategic positions across the Pacific. One of the key early turning points was the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. After months of intense fighting, Japanese expansion was halted, and the strategic initiative shifted to the United States. The fighting in the Pacific was especially fierce. Japanese forces rarely surrendered, and late in the war, kamikaze pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into Allied ships. By the end of World War II, the United States was fighting on 2 massive fronts, against Nazi Germany in Europe and against Imperial Japan in the Pacific. Its industrial capacity, financial resources, and military forces played a central role in the Allied victory. The Soviet Union bore the heaviest human cost. Britain stood alone in 1940. China endured years of invasion, and the United States became what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, supplying, fighting, and ultimately helping to defeat the Axis powers on a global scale. World War II was not won by one nation, but by a coalition whose combined strength reshaped the modern world. By 1945, after nearly 4 years of brutal fighting across the Pacific, Japan had been pushed back to its home islands. But surrender was far from certain. American military planners believed that invading Japan could cost hundreds of thousands, possibly even 1 million, US casualties. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had already shown how fiercely Japanese forces would resist. Back in 1943, at the Casablanca Conference, President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared that the war would end only with unconditional surrender. Germany was forced into that outcome in May 1945. Japan was not ready to follow. In August 1945, President Harry S. Truman made the decision that would change history. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more died later from radiation. 3 days later, a second bomb hit Nagasaki. At the same time, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-controlled Manchuria. Facing destruction, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th. The formal signing on September 2nd, 1945, marked the end of World War II. The morality of the atomic bombings is still debated. Supporters argue it prevented a massive invasion and even greater casualties. Critics argue the human cost was too high. What's undeniable is that nuclear weapons forever changed global politics. North Africa and Italy. The United States was not sitting on the sidelines in Europe. In November 1942, American and British forces launched Operation Torch in North Africa under General Dwight D. Eisenhower. By May 1943, German and Italian forces, including those led by Erwin Rommel, had surrendered. This forced Germany to divert troops away from the Eastern Front. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Benito Mussolini was overthrown, and Italy eventually surrendered, though German forces continued fighting there until 1945. These campaigns tied down significant German forces that might otherwise have been sent against the Soviet Union. D-Day and the Western Front. The full Second Front opened on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Under Eisenhower's command, Allied forces landed in Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. More than 150,000 troops landed on the first day. Casualties were heavy, but the invasion succeeded. Paris was liberated in August 1944. By early 1945, Germany was trapped between the Red Army advancing from the east and American and British forces pushing from the west. When Berlin fell in May 1945, it was the result of pressure from both directions. The bottom line: the Soviet Union bore the heaviest human cost and fought the largest ground battles of the war. That's a fact. But the United States supplied massive amounts of weapons, vehicles, fuel, and food through Lend-Lease fought and defeated Japan across the Pacific, helped defeat Axis forces in North Africa and Italy, opened the Western Front in France, pushed into Germany from the west. World War II was not won by one nation alone. It was a coalition victory. Without the Red Army, the Western Allies face a longer war. Without American industry and the Western Front, the Soviet Union faces a far deadlier one. History is rarely simple, but the record is clear. Defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan required the combined strength of multiple powers, fighting on multiple fronts across the entire globe.